Hello everybody and good evening. My name's Don Arleth and welcome to World News Tonight, coming to you live from Warsaw here on TVP World. The United States is finally lifting some restrictions on Ukraine to use long-range Western weapons on targets in Russia. But will this be a game changer, or is it too little, too late? We'll have more on that in just a minute, but first up, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Instead of imploding, Poland's AZOTY finds explosive new business. Latvia celebrates independence while wary of Russia's ambitions. And mass protests in Georgia after disputed elections. Ukraine is poised to strike into Russia with U.S.-made weapons, the New York Times reported last night. After no official confirmation, it now seems that the permission could be limited to the Russian Kursk region. Experts say that the decision may be coming too late to help Kyiv's war effort. Marek Steele reports.
Sumy, northern Ukraine, one of the sites of a deadly overnight Russian missile strike. The Russians killed 11 people.
I came running back and saw that everything was on fire.
The attacks came just a few hours after the New York Times reported that Biden had allowed Kyiv to strike military targets inside Russia with U.S. weapons. But there has been no explicit confirmation of the report.
Strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves.
The approval may for now be limited to the Russian Kursk region, reports indicate. That's where the Ukrainians control a chunk of Russian land.
As always, yesterday's news that Biden allows Ukraine to use US long-range missiles to hit targets deep in Russia turns out to be too good to be true. We have not seen any missile flying deep into Russia. Once we see it, then it will mean that he gave permission. For now, it's just words.
This is a U.S. ATACMS missile being launched by Ukrainian forces. Although it has a range of 300 kilometers, the missile couldn't be used against targets inside Russia.
The weapons we're discussing are not. They do not have a range of thousands of kilometers, so most of Russia will still be out of range.
However, the majority of the military sites used by Russia to attack Ukraine are within the range of ATACMS. Western Storm Shadow missiles and GMLRS that Kyiv operates also pose a threat to Russia if used against it.
It should be understood here that ATACMS is a ballistic missile. Storm Shadow, Scarp are cruise missiles. But in general, a missile is a missile. The destructive power is great.
An ATACMS ballistic missile can carry more than 200 kilograms of explosives at a speed of 1 kilometer per second. It is capable of destroying military bases, supply depots, and energy infrastructure. It can be fired from mobile launchers such as HIMARS.
Why I'm not, opening a champagne just yet is probably because we don't know the actual numbers of how many rockets Ukrainians do have.
It should have happened a year ago. It is quite a late but very expected step. And, I really feel sorry that for this step, more people had to die.
The question now is whether such a decision by the United States could change the course of the war, or rather, if it's not too late for that.
And Russia's foreign ministry says that Kyiv's use of long-range missiles to attack our territory would mean the direct involvement of the United States and its satellites in hostilities against Russia. Meanwhile, Russia continues to bomb civilian targets in Ukraine. Overnight, 11 people were killed by Russian airstrikes in the Sumy region in eastern Ukraine, and at least 8 people were killed after cruise missiles slammed into a residential area in the southern port city of Odessa. Now let's go to Oz Chatterjee, who's in Kyiv. Good evening, Oz. So what more can you tell us about these horrible attacks on civilians?
Good evening. Well, yes, it's been a very difficult 24 hours. Obviously, the large strike that happened on Sunday night. But Monday has been particularly difficult, as well as you said, there was a targeted strike on Odessa. Now, we do believe the death toll has risen to 10 people have been killed in this attack on Odessa, on the Primorsky district of Odessa, with 47 people reported injured after an Iskander ballistic missile was downed by Ukrainian air defenses. So this was a downed missile that still caused a huge amount of damage. So 10 people dead there, and there are children among the wounded as well. It's believed that about 7 police officers and 1 medic and 2 civilians were killed in this particular strike. Now, it's also been a very busy day for Kyiv. Zelensky has visited the front lines. Not the first time he's done that, but he visited the embattled areas in Donetsk on Monday, visiting the Pokrovsk direction, where he awarded medals to some of the soldiers defending those lines. They're coming under very, very, very difficult pressure by the Russians, still sustained into November, potentially into December, with these assaults still going on, not slowing down for the autumn period. So a difficult period for Ukraine, especially with the field of air defense. Even when air defenses are working, they are still resulting in missiles that down and kill civilians. So a dark period, dark 24 hours for Ukraine.
All right, Oz Chatterjee reporting for us there from Kyiv. Thank you for that, Oz. Foreign ministers from across the European Union gathered in Brussels on Monday. High on the agenda is the matter of Ukraine, in light of the recent news that China may be assisting Russia's war effort. Here's more on the topic from Sasha Farbach, our European Affairs correspondent.
More help for Ukraine. That is one of the most important things on the agenda as the foreign ministers of the European Union countries meet here in Brussels, discussing many things, everything from U.S.-EU relations to the situation in the Middle East. But namely, it's about how to help Ukraine even more. Now, with the restrictions of long-range missiles being lifted by the United States and also potentially France and the U.K., this will be the main item here on the agenda. Now, we can already hear it as the doorsteps and the arrivals, for instance, of the High Rep, Mr. Borrell. It was clear on their positions of what this means for Ukraine.
Have been saying once and again that Ukraine should be able to use the arm we provided to them in order to not only to stop the arrow, but also to be able to hit the Arcus. I continue believing this is what has to be done. I'm sure it will be discussed once again.
I think this is an adequate response, especially considering the North Korean troop presence now on the Russian side. So it's really a good reaction to that. What I do find unfortunate is that this has already been leaked. I would have preferred it if it had been a surprise for the Russians.
With that is, of course, the hope that Ukraine would get more. It's already making progress in this light, and it needs more. Now, this is the hope that more European allies will gather to also try and equip Ukraine with more. The question will now be, will Germany do that? But we're not expecting any firm conclusions from the German side here. Important point on Tuesday, also gathering of EU defense ministers here, which will also see the head of NATO, Mr. Rutte, in attendance to talk about a combined response to continued Russian aggression, much else. And we'll, of course, have more on that throughout the next days. With Sasha Farbach for TVP World in Brussels.
Poland's struggling state-owned chemical manufacturer AZOTY has found a new potential lifeline, sealing a deal with Polish defense leader PGZ for explosives production. This is part of a bigger push by Warsaw to increase the domestic manufacturing of munitions for the Polish armed forces. Konrad Gorlinski reports.
As the war in Ukraine has shown, even a very well-equipped army can empty its munition stocks in no time. That's why Poland wants to be prepared. A letter of intent signed Monday between Poland's largest chemical producer, AZOTY Group, and the Polish arms group PGZ, along with a couple of other companies, is the first step in that direction.
This is an important moment for Tarnów and an even more important moment for the security of Poland.
The plan is that AZOTY will begin production of nitrocellulose, a chemical compound used in explosives. Right now, Poland has to import it from abroad. AZOTY, Europe's second largest producer of nitrogen fertilizers has been struggling with mounting losses, posting a staggering €760 million deficit last year and carrying €2.3 billion in debt. Despite narrowing third-quarter losses to €52 million, the company remains deep in the red, and banks are starting to turn their backs on it. This deal could therefore mark a turning point for AZOTY, leveraging its Tarnów plant's raw material capabilities to tap into the booming explosives market, potentially transforming its fortunes.
The Polish National Electoral Commission has decided to reject last year's financial report of Law and Justice. In consequence, the party's 3-year subsidy amounting to 75 million zlotys, or over 17 million euros, could be revoked. Monday's decision comes following the National Electoral Commission's resolution in August. At the time, the Commission found financing irregularities in the Law and Justice election campaign. However, the August resolution is not legally binding, as the Law and Justice appealed to the Supreme Court. The court has not yet formally reviewed the appeal, and there is currently no deadline for reviewing the complaint. Until the Supreme Court reaches a decision, the Law and Justice Party will continue to receive the subsidies in question. Law and Justice is a right-wing populist conservative political party which formed the majority government between 2015 and 2023. Since 2023, it has been in the opposition. Latvia marks Independence Day today. Once again, the celebrations were overshadowed by the war in Ukraine and Russia's imperial expansionist ambitions. Ovidiusz Niceja reports.
Soldiers, tanks, an Air Force display, and plenty of NATO allies marching along. Latvia celebrates its independence, 106 years on.
We must be ready to defend our country today and tomorrow, always. In times of peace, we have the opportunity to learn and improve.
Latvia, along with neighboring Lithuania and Estonia, used to be part of the Soviet Union, just like Ukraine.
God forbid, if we are no more, then Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia will be next.
And Riga takes that threat seriously. In 2022, it spent just over 2% of its budget on defense. Now, it spends over 3%. Other Baltic states put up similar numbers. And prior to the invasion of Ukraine, all 3 spent around 2% of their GDP on the military.
Latvia leads by example. You are, as you said, spending more than 3% of GDP on defense. You are planning to do even more next year.
Latvia has just over 7,000 professional soldiers and 10,000 volunteers in the National Guard. That's why Riga cherishes its alliances. A 3,500 soldier-strong NATO multinational brigade led by Canada stands on guard for Latvia. The skies of the Baltic states are protected by the NATO air policing mission. And this is NATO's latest military drill in the Baltics, named Resolute Warrior. It includes thousands of soldiers from 13 nations and aims to demonstrate the alliance's resolve in protecting Latvia, in line with the principle of NATO Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all.
When someone is claiming that NATO is not united, you can have a look on the common exercises.
When Latvia declared its independence 106 years ago, it was invaded by Soviet Russia 13 days later. With the latest efforts to boost deterrence, Riga hopes to never again have to fight for the sovereignty it cherishes so much.
Protests in Georgia have intensified in the wake of the country's contested general elections, in which the pro-Russian Georgian Dream defeated an alliance of opposition parties. Many countries have refused to recognize the results, citing widespread irregularities. Demonstrators set up camps outside Parliament and Tbilisi State University on Monday, with thousands of protesters joining in rallies under the slogan, "Reclaim Your Vote." Pavel Trzaskowski has more.
The Georgian capital was wide awake in the early hours of Monday morning. Later in the day, the demonstrators set up camps blocking some streets in Tbilisi.
The barricade is part of the blockade. International law allows blockades, boycott and disobedience when democracy ends.
and the protesters claim that democracy ended when the Central Election Commission upheld on Saturday the results of October 26th general elections. During the Commission's recent session, opposition MP David Kirtaze splashed black liquid on its chairman, Georgi Kalandarishvili. Emotions and protests of such magnitude are not uncommon in Georgian politics.
In the immediate post-election situation, one actually expected some tensions in the Georgian capital.
And, according to Alex Krevo-Asatiani, Georgian opposition politician, they will probably only intensify.
We need to continue the protests going, and we need to increase the size of our protests, especially in the coming days.
That's because the first session of the new parliament is scheduled for next Monday. The ruling Georgian Dream Party, which won with almost 55% of the vote, will try to convene the parliament. But as opposition parties agreed to boycott the meeting until new elections are drawn, the quorum to do so might not be reached.
At least 100 members of parliament should convene in order to legitimize this new National Assembly.
Additionally, according to the Georgian constitution, the first parliament session should be convened by the president, Salome Zurabishvili. But she openly contests the results of the elections. So instead, the session is to be convened by the country's Prime Minister, Irakli Garibashvili of the Georgian Dream.
When that happens, we will officially be in Georgia under an illegitimate government.
This will effectively put the country into political deadlock. Its EU accession bid has already been halted, and the European Union has proposed imposing sanctions on the Georgian Dream.
More than 100 million euros will be frozen, and instead of being allocated to the government, will be allocated to the civil society organizations.
But as Tbilisi drifts towards Moscow, anti-Russian protests have erupted in Georgia's breakaway region of Abkhazia, which is recognized only by Russia and a handful of other countries. Demonstrators in the capital Sukhumi stormed the parliament building last week and continued to occupy it, protesting a law that would grant Russian investors the right to own property and land in Abkhazia.
U.S. President Joe Biden has finally made the long-delayed decision to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-made long-range weapons to attack targets in Russia. Will this give Ukraine a badly needed edge in its war for survival? I'm now joined by Robert Pschell, Senior Fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Good evening.
Now, what will this green light by Washington, what will it do for Ukraine's capabilities and its ability to defend itself, presumably in the next 2 months before President-elect Donald Trump is sworn in?
Well, there is no doubt that such a decision, which essentially involves lifting large part of the restriction on the use of the so-called ATACMS, longer range missiles in terms of what Ukraine had so far, what it has, and that's important because you need to strike at the Russian key points in order to prevent them from launching more and more effective offensives. So that will not so much, I think, giving an edge, that's too strong a word, certainly will not be a game changer. But like with many other elements of Ukrainian arsenal, which essentially Ukraine depends on its foreign partners, primarily in NATO, but not only, it will obviously help to, make up for the disproportion which Russia enjoys in Russia's favor. And certainly Russia is enjoying an excessive, if you like, disproportion when it comes to an ability to strike, the ability to launch offensive operations. So this would help. But the problem is we don't know exactly whether all the elements of the restrictions, meaning will Ukraine be able to hit other areas than just the Kursk province, which is what we keep hearing in the last hours or during the last day. So this is almost typical of the way that Ukrainians have to kind of endure various elements of foreign aid. Many capitals provided aid, but they usually provided later than anticipated. They provided with some restrictions, and they also, are not able to kind of provide sufficient numbers. And that is also another question to which we don't know the answer. How many actual missiles come with that decision? How many missiles does Ukraine has and how many are, let's say, on the way, because that will also depend, that will decide the effectiveness ratio of the potential use of those missile systems.
Yes, and the decision by Washington also allows the UK and France to provide Storm Shadow missiles also for use in targets in Russia. So far, the UK government has also refused to comment for operational security. What do you think this does for Ukraine? Some people talk about Trump-proofing this decision by the Biden administration in the final days.
Well, I hope, and this is, by the way, in itself, hope couched with a certain frustration, that it's just an example of certain imperfect communication strategy, because, we had, for it to be very precise, we had first came the news from France, essentially the source was Le Figaro newspaper, saying essentially that the Paris has given a green light for the use of the essentially British-French missile system, but which depends on US inputs. Then that was kind of walked back, and then in UK we had the educational minister saying that actually so far a green light has not been given. So this is important and not helpful, because part of the effectiveness is of this lifting of those restrictions lies in an ability to put Russia on the wrong footing, and that just does not, that allows Kremlin to kind of say, well, there you are, this guy's afraid of our escalation fear tactics, which Russia, of course, has been employing. So one hopes that both London and Paris will essentially follow up in making clear that they have either given a green light, or at least, they will not suggest that they have not. And that's important in itself, because Ukraine needs also that kind of support. This is essential on the battlefield, particularly when dealing with Russia, which of course has no inhibitions, and it's relying on that sort of escalation fear rhetoric to kind of wait for the US administration to come into power, and then perhaps indeed put more restrictions, or even reduce or hamper the assistance that US as a leader of the Western Alliance has been providing.
Meanwhile, we hear from the Russian Foreign Ministry that Kyiv's use of long-range missiles to attack our territory would mean the direct involvement of the United States and its satellites in hostilities against Russia. Is this a last-ditch effort to have the West self-impose these restrictions on in fact not giving the green light, and what does that say moving forward? Do we need to take this saber rattling by Moscow? Do we need to take this seriously, or is this a bluff?
No, in fact, we shouldn't even spend too much time discussing it, because that's actually what the Russians want. We are. Okay, so they've already achieved something. No, this is old, stale, repetitive, and as I tried to explain earlier, is part and parcel of Russian attempt. It's worth thinking about this for a second. What is the Russian narrative? It is an aggressor state. It keeps attacking Ukraine, violating, war conventions, and in fact, every single element of international law, attacking military, civilian, energy grid, etc., everything that is not allowed. And then it says, well, if you provide the victim with more abilities to defend itself, then somehow you're provoking us. This is nonsensical, and it should be ignored. It should be essentially act as an encouragement for the West and all the countries supporting Ukraine to provide more and faster, because in itself, this kind of disinformation propaganda narrative is showing that Kremlin is actually afraid of those supplies and many more to come. So that means it's exactly what we should be doing, and we should not pay attention to this very old and repetitive narrative, because it's just a pack of lies. That's all.
Now, we have about 2 months before the inauguration of the next president, Donald Trump. We see mixed signals coming from various individuals in the Trump team. So what are the likely scenarios that the president-elect could employ to end this war? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure the signals are that mixed. I mean, I think there is a lack of clarity on some of the elements of what is clear. What it is, I think, clear what the president-elect and many members of his team want, which is, as they put it, to kind of stop this war, and the path in general terms that they seem to be ready and wants to take is to kind of force, yes, that's the word, to force Ukraine into negotiation with Russia. The problem with this is simply that, first of all, Russia and Putin, we've heard it from numerous high-ranking officials, for example, Minister Lavrov, we had it from Medvedev, we had it from Peskov, the mouthpiece of Putin, essentially saying that the Russians are not interested in any kind of, quasi-rational form of restraint of some kind of negotiation. No, they just want a total capitulation of Ukraine, and their goals have not changed. They want to destroy Ukraine. So I think that's the first thing that the Trump administration, once it sort of outlines some elements more precisely of the plan, the peace plan, so-called. Well, it will kind of come across Moscow, which is not actually interested in the peace plan. It already rejected some proposals from Turkey, for example, and of course it leaves a question: how will Ukraine behave? Because at some point, there are various lines that Ukraine, even when put in an extremely difficult situation, and of course, stopping U.S. aid would indeed be that situation. Well, it does not really have anywhere to go, because we know what capitulation would mean. Would mean destruction, mass crimes, extermination, de facto of Ukrainians. This is the difficulty. So I think we need to hear more from the Trump administration, but the direction what they would like to achieve is the end of the war, the end of U.S. kind of spending money is clear. But on the other end of the scale is the fact that U.S. also, I think, and President Trump himself, President-elect, he does not want to lose or be shown to be a loser in this confrontation. So I think we'll see various interesting developments on that score.
And finally, just before we go, we've got about a minute and a half left. Turkish President Erdogan is pitching his own peace plan for Ukraine to the G20 members in Rio de Janeiro, calling for a DMZ in eastern Ukraine and a delay on NATO membership for 10 years, among others. What are your thoughts generally on this proposal by President Erdogan?
Well, again, I mean, I've just said, I mean, the first reactions from Russians specifically to the plan was that they don't know the details, even though I think the Turkish colleagues have kind of spoke to us in public. So I think this is exactly the game that the Russians will play. And then Ukrainians themselves, I think they already mentioned what they think of some kind of a freeze of the situation of frontline without any concrete security guarantees. So I'm not sure if this particular plan has much kind of utility, but of course we'll see. I mean, there's various people discussing, and G20 is taking place, unfortunately, with some form of Russian participation, of course.
Okay, well, it seems time will soon tell which direction we're actually headed. Robert Pshel, Senior Fellow at Center for Eastern Studies, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for joining me. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.